documentary and to share it with our audience. And I'll start with Dean Nelson.
Thanks very much, Dean Holcomb-McCoy. I'm assuming everyone can hear me. I thought this was an incredible documentary, and I'm moved, and I'm frankly a bit emotional. You know, I've been a dean. This is I'm going into my 10th year in the fall, and I consider myself an educator first and foremost. My dad was also a teacher, and then later a principal, and that begs a lot of questions in terms of cultural competency and the need to have diverse teaching faculty, people who work with our students, our youth, and leadership. But you asked about sort of what in our backgrounds might particularly resonate with what we just saw. And for me, part of my scholarly hat has been working on mental health issues insofar as we have a greater need to explore the intersection of criminality and its impacts on mental health, and the ways in that debilitated mental health and racism in turn engage the criminal justice system on the one hand. So the larger question there in my scholarship is, how are people of color, Black people in particular, who have mental health vulnerabilities, is the language I use, treated by the criminal justice system? All the while recognizing that there are numerous additional reasons why people of color suffer disparate mental health outcomes and realities. On a personal level, you know, the reason I'm a bit emotional is I think educators and teachers in particular of our youth, who are those who are most precious to us, have such power. And my general theory is, you know, whenever there's discretion, it's generally not exercised in our favor. And so when you have teachers who are so powerful in the lives of young people, impressionable young people, exercising discretion in ways that don't support, uplift, embrace, empower, but instead tear down the next generation, it is potentially catastrophic for one's outcome. So, you know, all of us, I'm sure, have our own very personal, troubling engagements with some teachers we've had in our backgrounds, and hopefully on the other side, some positive, uplifting ones. But it just floats to the surface that those who have discretion must exercise it wisely and in a way that is anti-racist. And I know that's going to be much of what we discuss, but I think in a nutshell, there is that kernel of how do we exercise our power and our discretion?
Absolutely. Thank you for that. And we will get deeper into strategies and the call to action. I think that's a part of this conversation. What are we going to do? Lyric.
So I am a teacher. I've been a teacher for about 3 years. I've taught for 2 years here in DC and 1 year in Atlanta. I've always been a teacher at a school that taught predominantly students of color. I also worked at a camp that worked with students of color. So my whole life has been focused around helping people who look like me. It's been really interesting being a middle school teacher, especially with students who are Black and brown, students who 99% are Black and brown, who all have very unique backgrounds and very unique struggles and difficulties. And it's made it very interesting to see this documentary and this book, especially in the light of that. I feel like I've taken a new perspective when I'm teaching my students. I found it really powerful and fascinating to think about the students mostly in this documentary and the book being a little bit older than the kids I have now, but thinking about the path they're already on. So hearing kids now say that they hate being in school or have these horrible experiences with teachers, and thinking that, okay, how can I, in my position as their teacher, change that structure? Or studying education policy, one of the things that brought me to that whole program was seeing a school where students weren't being treated fairly, and thinking about, okay, well, I know that I can't save the world from my classroom as much as I wish I could, but how can I get in the position where I can?
Right, right. And we're going to talk more about that, and love to hear more about your experiences in the classroom. So we'll hold on to that. Thank you, Lyric. Dr. DeCuir.
Yes, so thank you, Dean Holcomb-McCoy, and the rest of the panelists and hosts for organizing this event. It's an honor to be here on this panel. My interest and motivation in educating Black girls came from the very moment when I realized I wanted to be a classroom teacher. My teaching career began in DC public schools many, many years ago, in a school that was predominantly Black. And I had a particular interest and focus in making sure that the Black girls and the Black boys in my class had an equitable experience in my classroom. But looking back on my teaching in those early years, I realized I made some fumbles. I think I had great intentions and wanted to do right by my students, but didn't have the strategies that I needed to enact what I now know is anti-racist pedagogy. So fast forward many years later, my research now does center on issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and what that looks like from the position of school leaders, but also what that looks like in a classroom with classroom teachers. And so the work that I do here at AU is all about giving pre-service teachers and students who are interested in education a strong understanding of what it means to be culturally responsive. And we heard this phrase in the movie, in the documentary rather, on multiple occasions. What we didn't hear in the documentary directly, but it's definitely alluded to, is the power of anti-racist pedagogies and what that can do to transform an individual student, and also what it can do to transform a classroom in a school. So I'm interested in being part of this panel to continue those discussions about culturally relevant pedagogies and anti-racist pedagogies in leadership.
Well, that's a good segue. Thank you, Dr. DeCuir. That's a good segue into one of my first question. And before we go into some of the questions that, the polling questions that we have, in the documentary, it was alluded to that there is a shortage of Black women teachers. And actually, according to the National Center for Education Statistics, 7% of the 4 million teachers in the United States are Black, while Black girls make up 16% of the student population. And I want to get the panel, your views on whether or not you think this shortage of Black women teachers is truly a contributing factor to how Black girls are perceived and treated in schools. Do you agree with that? Do you disagree with that? And what are the implications then for the training of teachers and the implications for white teachers? Because as we see the decline of Black teachers and teachers of color in general in schools, we're seeing a steady rate of white women teachers in schools. And I wonder what you think are some of those implications. So if you could just talk a little bit about that. What's your sense? Anyone can go.
It's awkward on a on a panel like this when I can't use eye contact. So if my panelists don't mind, I can start and then be able to have the others continue the conversation. I think that the shortage of Black women teachers in schools is a contributing factor to how Black girls experience school today. One, I think that the film describes culturally responsive pedagogy or culturally responsive teaching and learning as a strategy to advance equity in our schools. And what that means is teaching and learning practices that are rooted in the histories, traditions, and the funds of knowledge that are embedded within communities, and particularly marginalized communities. So with the shortage of Black women teachers in schools, that then means that there are fewer advocates for this type of pedagogy in our schools. And that makes a clear obstruction in the advancement of equity. We just don't have as many culturally responsive cheerleaders that would be advocating for this type of instruction, which would be a direct benefit to Black girls and to all students, I would argue. I also think that the film makes a very clear description of girls suffering from implicit bias that has been directed at them in ways that are harmful and punitive and damaging. And I think that implicit bias is often reproduced in spaces where stereotypes and discrimination go unchallenged. And so with a shortage of Black women teachers in our classrooms and in our schools, these biases are allowed to be reproduced, and we don't have enough advocates to disrupt those reproductions. I can pause there.
Any other comments? Camille or
Going off of that, it's also so important to have relationships with students, and having a relationship with someone who looks like you or can relate to your experiences is really important. So I know I can't remember having a Black teacher besides when I was homeschooled, and I'd never felt like I had that person who was really like experiencing what I had experienced, someone I could fully relate to on all the levels, and someone who didn't have that bias going into it, someone who wasn't thinking of me in that light where the media portrays Black girls as aggressive and impulsive and disrespectful. It's nice being that teacher for someone. So the school where I teach is predominantly Black teachers, and being able to see my students having people to relate to, or being able to have conversations with students where I can say, yeah, I understand what you're going through. I understand your feelings. I've been there. Trust me, it hurts. And then being able to take that and help them frame a new way to think about that experience is really important. And if you don't have Black teachers, you can't have that same connection.
And I'll just jump in briefly to say I echo what my panelists have said. I think it's crucial. And I also want to say that it elevates the possibility of connecting with parents, which is absolutely essential given what we know our students, our children experience in, from kindergarten all the way through higher ed. And I add, on a personal level, I didn't have a Black teacher until I was in law school, which when you think about it is ridiculous. But I knew the possibility existed because my dad was a teacher. And, again, to the opening up of one's vision and sense of what is possible for oneself, I think it is crucial that the people who engage with us and our children for probably just as many hours a day as we do as parents and family members have shared life experiences, and empathy is really, really important. And on the other hand, I also want to say, to the extent that, teachers, Black women teachers only represent 7%, we as educational leaders and other educational leaders out there also have to recognize the added toll and burden, no doubt, the extra work that we inevitably are asking those few teachers nationwide to take on, and to be sure to protect and elevate them and uplift them, because they are doing additional, often unseen work given their scarcity.
Absolutely. And I think, that extra burden, I think, for Black teachers, given the lower numbers that we're seeing of Black teachers coming into the profession, and the additional burden is a real dynamic, and it's true. There's also, we've been talking about for years about culturally responsive training, and training per se, I hate the word training, but trying to help white teachers become more aware. This notion of, Black girls are sacred and loved at the end of the documentary, I thought was very powerful, because we're saying we want teachers and educators and everyone to recognize that Black girls matter. And so it's not just Black teachers that can do this work, it's everyone in the school building. Would you agree? And is that something that, are we getting there? And I want Amaarah to talk a little bit about what has to happen for all of our teachers to be able to get to the point that they're actually not just saying Black girls are sacred and loved, but they're showing it as well. They're actually demonstrating that and ensuring that Black girls feel that. I mean, what has to happen in teacher preparation? I just want to hit that point a little bit. What has to happen in your opinion?
So in my opinion, we need to have all teachers, irregardless of their identities and the ways in which they experienced school when they were younger, they all need to agree to enact anti-racist pedagogies. It's no longer good enough in our society to just be not racist. It's no longer good enough to just acknowledge, that racism or sexism is taking place. But by enacting anti-racist pedagogies, it obligates teachers to do 3 things. And these 3 things we can be teaching them here at AU, and we do teach them in our teacher preparation programs. And teachers can continue to grow and develop these strategies while they are currently in classrooms. It's access, So having meaningful access to opportunities to be successful in school and to increase achievement, it's identity and having yourself reflected in your curriculum, what you are learning and what you are experiencing in school. And it's empowerment, a sense of agency to be able to transform your own experiences and that of your communities. And when we have teachers who are willing to interrogate their own identities, when we have teachers who are willing to create access and opportunities and empowerment for our young people, and meaningfully talk about racism and inequities in the classroom, we will begin to disrupt the inequities that we see in this documentary. And that's not something that only Black women teachers can do. Those are skills that we can teach to any teacher who's in a classroom with any child.
Absolutely. I just saw one question from the audience, and I'm gonna ask this really quickly. Amaarah, Dr. DeCuir, what do you think? Do you think there's any grade level that if you had to choose to increase Black teachers first, which grade level or what area, middle school, elementary, or high? I'm just curious, I'm putting you on the spot. Wow.
I'll put my money on middle school, because I've always claimed middle school teachers as the ones who are gifted with teaching children in their identity forming years.
Good.
It's an unfair question, but I'll play along. Middle school.
Right. I have one more question, and then we'll go to our polling questions. There was one part of the documentary in which I think it was outside of in Ohio, where there was the case of a strip search of 4 young Black girls. And I just want, to know, what are your thoughts about, laws and policies that would protect students from that even happening, those scenarios even happening? I mean, what are some, because often we hear it was the policy. I think it was a young Black girl that was arrested in Florida. It was a kindergarten child that was arrested a couple of months ago, and it was a video and it went viral. She was asking, to save me, when the police officer was arresting her. How does this happen? And, when we hear that that was the policy, that's the policy of the school district, what do we need to do to protect students from, and Black girls in particular, from those types of scenarios? And I'll pose that to our dean of law, the law school, when we think about the criminal justice system and laws that aren't necessarily protecting Black women, Black girls, Black children, and the same for our graduate student in ed policy and leadership. What are some of your thoughts?
So the conflation of criminality and education in this space is highly problematic. So on the one hand, the fact that we have these policies qua law, like quasi law, begs interrogation, right? Number one. Number two, the ways in which these rules, policies, quasi laws are applied also begs interrogation, because that's exactly where we see the implicit bias coming into the decision-making exercise of discretion, right? Because even if these laws or policies exist, when we break it down and see who's actually being funneled through these processes and policies, that's where you see the race and the gender and the socioeconomic status and the class, and no doubt sexual orientation and a lot of things, identity biases playing out. So even if the problematic policy is on the books, as it were, which begs interrogation, I said, the application of these rules is exactly the site at which we need to be seriously analyzing and frankly deconstructing and abolishing, right? If they are basically producing inequity and trauma. I mean, at the end of the day, I think the case, the strip search was in Binghamton, New York, I believe it was, at a middle school. We can look at it, but how deeply traumatizing that would be for anyone to experience in those types of circumstances. I mean, I think it's rife for a lot of serious legal analysis on multiple levels, but you've got the policy or the law and you've got its application, both of them problematic.
Absolutely. Lyric, you want to add anything to that? around the policies, education policies related
Part
to
of
protection
part of
Black
my thoughts on that is, if that is the policy that we have to follow, if there's no way that we can change the policy, then what do we do to protect from the trauma that could cause? So where is someone, a trusted adult with them? Where is someone that they can recognize or look to? Where's a parent? Where's a guardian? Where's someone to be with them during that time? Because if we're saying we can't change the policy and that they have to have a strip search, okay, that it's horrible, but if that has to be the case, that has to be the case. But where are the people to protect? Like, where's a little barrier between a very untrusted adult and an unsafe situation that's causing more additional trauma?
Mhm. Yeah, and the policies and who is empowered to change the policies, because policies can always be changed, right? So when we look at who holds the responsibility in this, to review policies to ensure that policies aren't further perpetuating racist behaviors. We do know there are racist policies, how that plays out. It's interesting. As we talk about policies and laws, and as we think about where do we intervene, this is one of the areas that's always struck me as being an area that we need empowerment, not only of educators, but also community members. Because often it's elected officials on school boards and the places where that power is, where that it could be changed. We have the power to change those people, to ensure that we have people there that actually believe Black girls are sacred and loved, right? So that's really important. I'm going to move. We have, I want to make sure that we have time for the polling questions. And so I'm going to turn it over, I think, to one of our staff members who's going to ask the polling questions.
Hello. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah. Hi, Shayna. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Great. I'm fine. Do you want to go ahead with the questions?
Yes. So we had a lot of interest, and it looks like the first question that people were most interested in, based on what you have seen in the documentary and your personal knowledge, what do you think is the first step in addressing the criminalization of Black girls in school?
I can start. Education for me is the first step. Education and awareness. That's why I teach. That's why I do my research. That's why I supported this particular panel. I think that unfortunately the reality is that not all teachers recognize this PUSHOUT book and the phenomenon that it's describing. I don't think that all pre-service teachers who are preparing to go into a classroom, I don't think they recognize this. I don't think the general public is aware of this reality. And even Black girls and Black women, I don't think that there's enough awareness in our own community of this phenomenon. And so I think that the first step to address the criminalization of Black girls is to teach about it and to talk about it. And then from there, we need to get into advocacy. But I think the very first step is to have this be more public knowledge and acknowledged by those who are in positions of education leadership.
I agree. I want to just layer on the point about leadership and the possibility of disruption with the examples that were given in the documentary and other examples that have been in the media. At each turn, there have been people who have made bad decisions for our girls, right? Mm-hmm. And it begs a question of what has happened with them in terms of accountability and their professional, opportunities, and how are they trained and or disciplined further, right? But to the extent that we are expecting the young people and the young girls in this case to de-escalate, I'd like to focus on those who are involved in the actual decision making, who are interpreting potential, lack of deference. They're interpreting it as disobedience. And interpreting a question as disruption, et cetera, et cetera. And that's exactly the space where someone, and it begs the leadership question, has to say, she was just asking a question, or she's 7. Like, you know, like, we are not going to drag her out of a classroom. No. And in fact, we're going to talk to you about your impulse to drag her out of a classroom. So I just want to layer on that these are multifaceted dynamics, and I think it has to, I don't know if it's a linear as much as a holistic approach that needs to be brought to bear on the problem solving.
I would agree with what's been said. I would also say just something for the teachers, because until you're training the teachers on what, like, their own implicit bias, they're not going to be able to make those same changes. Because even having administration tell me something that I need to change in my classroom, unless I'm aware that it's something that I really do need to change and I'm seeing a reason why, and I'm seeing my own implicit bias as to how I'm making these decisions in my classroom, then nothing's going to really be able to make big change, especially because teachers have so much say over what is considered insubordination. You're going to send something out of the classroom based on your own perceptions of what actually happened, what was the action that made you upset. But until you're aware that part of your decision on making in having that consequence is your own implicit bias, your own perceptions from the media, your own perceptions from what you're seeing in the classroom, there's not going to be a change.
If I can build on what Dean Nelson had said, if we do accept that there needs to be a holistic solution, then it's all hands on deck. It's people who are in positions of education leadership that need to be at the front line of addressing this. It is people who are in the fields of law and policy that need to be on the front line of addressing this. It's our faith and community leaders that need to be involved with education and awareness so that we do have opportunities for family engagement and community engagement to disrupt this. It's therapists, it's social workers, it's classroom teachers, it's pre-service teacher educators. There's room for everyone to be involved in this disruption so that we can make this stop. There's no need to be slow, and there's no need to be patient. There's a need for urgency. Children are being harmed.
Yeah, and just on top of that, I think I agree with everything that everyone has said. And there are certain policies that really do highlight the criminalization of young Black girls in schools. If we look at suspension and discipline policies that are that actually replicate and mirror some of the adult policies and laws in schools, and creates this pipeline. When we talk about the school to prison pipeline, most of that pipeline is being held up by these policies, and often are around discipline, suspension, and expulsion policies. So, you know, I would just, to add to what we're talking about with leadership, is having bold leadership that will look at those policies and make changes. I think that's a good place to start too. Shana, let's go to the next question.
Sure. So the next question is asking about tools. And it says, what tools are necessary to help combat adultifying Black girls in society? How has this dynamic been reinforced by popular culture? So that might be film, literature, advertising, etc. And in your experience, how has adultification affected the dynamics of the classroom?
So I can start with the classroom. Adultification of Black girls impacts the classroom when we speak about discipline and disciplinary responses by classroom teachers. The documentary alluded to the fact that African American girls are disproportionately punished for subjective disciplinary infractions. Things like disrespectful attitude, insubordination, talking back, talking out. these are coded phrases that that let us know that these young girls are being adultified. Their behaviors are being translated as confrontational adult behaviors. And so we are risking girls being swept up in a disciplinary punitive response in the classroom. And then the second impact that I would describe in the classroom is the absence of a nurturing, caring, empowering relationship between a teacher and their student. If Black girls are adultified in classrooms, we as teachers are less likely to nurture them and care for them and support them with the tools that they need to be successful in our classrooms, because we are making the translation that these are adults or adult-like beings in our classrooms that don't need the same level of nurturing, care, patience, courtesy, excuse that you would give to others. So at least in the classroom, it has a very detrimental effect to Black girls.
To build off of that, I was also thinking when we adultify Black girls, we assume that they are in charge of making their own decisions and they have the capability to make adult-like decisions. So when a student isn't doing work or is coming to school late or is tired, we're putting all of the blame on the student rather than assuming maybe the mom didn't get up late and take her to school, or maybe there was some other factor that's the reason why she's not doing this, not that she has the full capability and full clarity of mind to make these decisions that we would not assume another student at that same age could make.
Right. It really does take away the possibility for many people of empathy as well. If they would see someone who is struggling and on one hand and sort of recognize the childhood and the childlike vulnerability, on average for kids of color, people, whether it's police or teachers or whoever is viewing them, adds 4 years. Right? It's the same conversation of, when the police officers turn up and they see Tamir Rice, they don't see a 12-year-old. They see a 16-year-old, right? And so the young woman in the documentary, I want to say Samaya, I think her name was, she's 7 when she's roaming around on her own, uncared for by her educators. But they think, the people in the restaurant think she's 12. Even that's too young. 16 was too young, would have been too young for Tamir as well. But in that gap, I think what you see is a lack of empathy, right? And an added burden to behave in a certain way that then would comport with someone who is presumed to be an older age and therefore more responsible and accountable, et cetera, and more adult-like in their ability to attract punishment as opposed to education, right? So we slip from our role as healing educators, nourishing educators, supportive, into this more disciplinary, punishing type of emphasis, which is, again, I can't not use the word potentially catastrophic.
So fellow panelists, how can we combat this? What would we advise to the audience members to disrupt this adultification?
So I'll just, put a plug in for one of the things you said earlier, Dr. DeCuir, around awareness. We don't know what we don't know. And we're all somewhat students of these societal problems because we care deeply, and it's personal as well, but we care deeply. And, we have a wonderful teacher who's with us and is doing this work every day. But, I think there is much to be gleaned from acknowledging where we are, making ourselves and our community members aware. And then frankly, I will tell you, I believe that teachers need to be embraced, uplifted, and I think paid a whole lot more than they're paid, and supported a whole lot better than they're supported, to recognize this as the profession that it is and accord it the same type of level of societal respect and therefore, support that we see in other professions.
You get no complaint there, Dee Nelson. No complaint there. But I hear from teachers all the time that say, I'm trying, but it's hard because I'm fearful that if I push too hard for my students, I might get dismissed. I could get fired. So, it's often I worry about that we don't have enough of a critical mass of our leaders and our teachers, so that there is that fear of loving your students, loving, doing the right thing on behalf of your students, that, the fear of being possibly fired for going against a particular policy or questioning a policy is really bothersome. And how this call to action question is a good one, but I hear the but all the time when I'm talking to students and talking to teachers, and I'm just wondering what your thoughts are about that. I mean, as we graduate new teachers and we know they're not staying, the rate of retention of our teachers, particularly our teachers of color, is very low. For this reason of not being able to do what they believe is right. They're coming up against policies, barriers, leaders who aren't on the same page, other teachers that aren't on the same page. How do we combat that?
Personally, I deal with that all the time. I get told all the time while I'm at work that I'm too soft with my students, or I'm too generous, or I let them get away with too much. But that's because there's a lot of what would be considered insubordination in other classes that I just consider kids being kids. And it's really hard when I feel like me and maybe 2 or 3 other people on my team are fighting for the kids, or fighting to let kids have privileges, or things that you would think shouldn't be taken away from students that are getting taken away. And it's scary when I feel like if I make the wrong move or say the wrong thing, I'm at risk of losing my job. And there has to be some support for teachers that has to come from policies, administration, top-down policies that support teachers, that allow for that flexibility to, if you see a student who needs support and you need to go pull them out of their classroom and sit with them for 5 minutes and talk, that shouldn't be something that gets me in trouble or gets the student in trouble. That should be something that is encouraged and should be supported by my administration, rather than being something that's considered, oh, you're pulling a student out of class and you're walking away from your own classroom. There just has to be some backing for teachers, so that when you want to go into battle, so to say, for your students, that there's something to fall on, something to fall back onto.
So one thing that I would want to have for teachers to fall back on is data and research. And I think that for those of us that are embedded in universities, we need to be supporting these equity-oriented, social justice-oriented classroom teachers with the data and the research that supports that what they are doing is effective, and that what they are doing is promoting student achievement, right? And looking at achievement beyond standardized test scores, but looking at whole child achievement. We've created this system where we respond to data and we respond to numbers, but at the same time, we in research can provide that shield and that strength for classroom teachers to say what you are doing is evidence-based best practices, and here is the data and the research to support you, and be able to partner with teachers to advocate for change at the school and district level, so that there is space for equity-oriented and social justice-oriented teachers.
And one of the points that was made in the documentary, in terms of resource flow, even in times of constraints, right? How we prioritize scarce resources has to be consistent with who we say we are and what we say we care about. And if it is child-centered, and if it is about inclusion and uplift and culturally responsive pedagogy, certainly that has to appear in our evaluative frames and our incentive structures, as constrained as they are. The resources have to flow consistent with what we're trying to achieve in those areas as well. So I just want to second that, and also beg the leadership question, because I think as well, when the leadership starts to encourage, support, incentivize, protect, certain outcomes consistent with what you're saying, Dr. DeCuir, and what Lyric said, I think we start to see, hopefully with time, different outcomes and different behaviors as well. So what I'm saying, Lyric, is you need to be a principal. Or superintendent, how's that? Superintendent, I'll just go straight for that.
That's where she needs to go. Okay, Shayna, another question.
Great, so our final poll question. Black girls are often seen as guilty even before they have had the opportunity to explain themselves. Does responsibility lie with school district policy, state legislation, or enforcement? And how should this be addressed?
So the question indicates, I think, a societal problem, a larger problem in terms of Black criminality and the pathologization of Blackness more broadly, in terms of the ascription of guilt as opposed to the presumption of innocence. And so I think this is just another space where we see these types of biases and frankly racism and sexism, and this is the intersection we're talking about, playing out. It's not surprising, it's just unfortunately consistent with larger societal norms that do not promote the presumption of innocence when it comes to Blackness. Not saying it's right, I don't want to be heard as saying that. I'm saying this is consistent and we have to interrogate that larger question of our own societal challenges around racism and sexism and the intersection of both to further dig down into this particular space.
And going off of Dean Nelson's comments, I think that school leaders are also responsible for this reality. School leaders are the ones that are defining school and classroom climate. They're the ones who are hiring the teachers. They're the ones setting the expectations for teachers and making decisions to supervise and retain teachers. They are the ones who are developing our school systems and implementing and enacting our school systems. So where it lies within the school building itself and within the school system, there definitely needs to be responsibility laid at the feet of our school leaders.
I have a quick question, but I'm thinking about, you know, school leaders are trained often in instruction, they're instructional leaders, they know about school law and policies. I'm just wondering, as I was listening to Dean Nelson talk, I mean, what typically is the intersection of educators and legal scholars and law enforcement folks? I mean, do you get the sense that there's conversations about these topics across these three groups? I mean, often educators will know about their educational setting, but not necessarily be as knowledgeable about the ins and outs of the legal system, right? And, you know, a savvy parent, you know, who might have some law background might be able to help their child navigate, you know, if their child gets in trouble. It's that social capital piece, you know, that they have that knowledge to sort of manage the system. But most parents, and we talk about Black parents, we fear the criminal justice system. We understand that we often get the brunt of, you know, bad policies and laws or whatever. They are often structured in a way that we often brunt a lot of the pain. But do you see a space, talking about, you know, call to action, would there be a space that, or the one that you know of, where the groups are coming together to talk about these issues?
I think that's a brilliant idea. I think we don't talk about these ideas and these challenges enough. I think we disciplinarily tend to be quite siloed, even within the law. So you have the educational law folks over here even, and then you have the criminal law folks over here, then you have the critical race theorists over here and the feminist jurisprudence over here. And really we're talking about, even within the law, throwing that together with the ed policy folks, with the social worker folks, with the, right? So I think part of this surfaces the sort of fiction of getting to a solution through any one discipline. So I mean, I'm learning a tremendous amount from all of you, and I think we need to continue to stay in conversation. And I think in terms of the parent piece, you know, I was struck by the first parent saying, you know, we sort of initially deferred in a sense to the teacher. Whereas, you know, it's sort of funny, as a lawyer and as a parent and sort of being through what we've been through, I think many of us perhaps would not have had that much deference, perhaps, you know? And, you know, so so much of it is societal placement and what's your understanding of how the system works or doesn't work, and how also do we uplift parents in those circumstances so they have the tools they need to protect their children in a system or systems that may or may not be properly servicing and serving their children as well. And from my vantage point, what is the role of a law school in that, and lawyers in helping those parents, for example, and those kids to help those kids ultimately?
Right, right. And you bring up the point about parent, parent engagement and parent empowerment, not just parents, but family members, community members. I'm interested in hearing, Lyric and Dr. DeCuir, your thoughts about, because there were I thought some very powerful interviews with parents in the documentary, and this need for empowering parents to understand, they understand what's happening to their children, but not necessarily the systems in which their children are living and having to negotiate. What are some of your thoughts about, as we think of a call to action, what we need to do? What are some ideas that you have around working with communities, working with parents, guardians, family members of Black girls?
I think in the same way that we need to train teachers to understand what they're dealing with, we need to train parents to understand what what their children are dealing with. Because if parents aren't fully aware of the policies that are impacting their students, or they don't have a guide, there's something that explains to them why their student was suspended for this reason, and when the parent asks, it's just a policy. Parents need to be able to have the full information or to advocate for their student, because it's very hard for, at least in my school, it's very hard for us when I'm trying to call a parent to explain a situation, or a parent calls me to try to get clarity on something, when all I can say is, the school said it was the policy, but here's what really happened. If that's not happening universally, or if the parent doesn't understand that full policy, the parent's just gonna feel like, oh, my student's continually getting in trouble, but they're not sure why. There's no clarity on why does my kid keep getting in trouble for the same reason if they don't have a policy understanding. There needs to be some sort of training, some sort of explanation for parents, some sort of how we give out student handbooks, like a guide for parents, like a parent handbook that just explains all of those policies, so that when they do come into the school to advocate for their student, they have the full breadth of knowledge that they need.
I think that when we realize that many of the parents who are parenting today's Black girls are the same young people who were also harmed by schools when they were younger, we need to approach this with a greater sense of sensitivity and care in how we create these opportunities to come into schools like Mary McLeod Bethune and be able to advocate effectively for your young person. I think that what the documentary did very well was talk about the powerful work that nonprofits are doing in this space of healing and therapy and anti-racist work. And I think that in many communities across the country, faith and community leaders are taking that role on and providing a space where families are able to understand the system itself and how it's impacting their young people. And I think that schools need to continue to partner with local nonprofit organizations to do that work, so that parents have safe spaces to learn and to grow and to question, and to be able to be advocates and have a sense of agency when caring for the needs of their children. But I do agree with what Lyric is suggesting, that there's a space in our schools for parents to be more involved. But unfortunately, the schools have not done an effective job in empowering parents to be effective advocates for their children, because we're placing the responsibility on parents to figure it out for themselves.
So that's truly an area that, if we wanted to move this forward on behalf of Black girls, that I think community and parent engagement is key. Okay, so that was a fast hour. I can't believe that we have like 6 minutes, and maybe I'll let each of you have a minute, to say anything else you want to say to our audience out there that are probably doing this work and have tuned in because they really care. Anything you want to say to our audience today before
Can I just say really quickly, Cheryl, first of all, thanks so much for bringing us together. I appreciate all the work of the organizers. I think this has been phenomenal. And like I said, I've learned a great deal, and I hope this is the first of many conversations. You know, as I think about education and the ways in which it's been commoditized and made scarce in its commoditization, it also makes me think about sort of, you know, the ways in which people fight to get the best education possible for their kids, and the sort of entitlement and privilege that often attaches in that fight. And I want to recognize at sort of the macro level that what we're talking about is education as a pipeline to possibility, right? It's a pipeline towards a brighter future. And it's a site that is a civil rights and human rights site. And I think the type of conversation we're having today belies exactly what's at stake. I mean, I think so much is at stake and it cannot be overstated. And so this work is crucial, and thinking about how we support and empower all of the kids, but especially when we know there are grave trauma-inducing disparities that persist, we really have to do more to continue in our efforts, because there's just too much at stake. And it's not just for the individual child, that's crucial, and their families. It's about communities as well. And ultimately, when we shoot out, you know, 10, 20 years or more, it's about what does this nation look like if we are consistently depriving people of an education, and therefore elevated future possibilities in their arcs, their lives, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. Thanks, Camille. Amaarah or Lyric.
So if I could just reiterate the importance of engagement and education and awareness. Once we as individuals are aware of something, and once we learn something, we're obligated to do something with that knowledge. And there is a role to play in the solution for every one of us in this Zoom call in this moment, whether your interests and your expertise lies in business or in education or in law or in the arts or in therapy, social work. There is work to be done. I am a strong advocate, and I believe very passionately about the power of our traditional public schools to do right by all children. But the reality is left unmanaged and without holding our schools accountable, we see the ills of society harming what's happening within our schools. So I think that it's imperative that all of us, now that we've seen this documentary, we all have received this call to action. And the next step lies with all of us individually. What do we do with this knowledge, and how do we use it to change us and to change the people who are closest to us?
Great. Thank you, Amaarah. Thanks a lot. Lyric.
I think that kind of my final thoughts, just that this is something we all need to take on together, because having this as a one-person fight, it just means that one person in a room screaming isn't doing anything. But if we're all collectively screaming for the same thing, maybe the message will get across. Having all these people who can watch this movie or listen to this panel or read the book, just having that awareness of implicit bias of our own perceptions of reality and how we see the world and how we see Black girls. I'm just hoping that we start to see some change, because being in the classroom, being on the front lines every day, it's like a fight that I don't know if we can win it if we're all in it by ourselves. We have to fight together.
I think you're absolutely right. And that's a good segue into our conclusion. I could talk all night about this. We could stay together and talk another couple of hours, but we have to end. And I want to say I feel so lucky and honored to be on this panel with three sacred and very loved Black women. So I want to thank you all for being here today, and for all of the folks out there that signed in and participated with us today. We hope that you will stay engaged with us, and as we continue this conversation. We will be in touch, because I believe there's so much more for us to talk about and for us to do. So thank you for being a part of this today, and we will be in touch. And remember to love Black girls. They're sacred and loved. They matter. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, Dean. Can I just make a brief announcement before we